The day I buried my wife, my son buried our relationship. He thought I was broken. He thought I was weak. But he had no idea. I was already planning his downfall. I never thought I would feel so utterly alone in a room that was supposedly filled with people who cared about me, yet as I looked around, every face seemed distant, distracted, or carefully pretending to offer comfort, and all I felt was an unbearable emptiness that pressed down on my chest like a weight I could not lift. The air smelled of flowers and incense, a delicate, almost sweet scent that clashed horribly with the sharp sting of grief that had taken root inside me and refused to let go. My wife, the woman who had been my world for decades, lay inside a coffin that seemed impossibly small for the magnitude of her life, and I could not stop staring at her face, imagining that she might suddenly open her eyes and scold me for crying too much, for being so weak, for letting life drag me down without her guiding hand. My son, the boy I had raised with my own blood and sweat, stood there like a stranger, his posture stiff, his expression cold, and when our eyes met, I searched for even a hint of the warmth I had known as a child, only to find none. I reached out instinctively, my hand trembling, hoping for some connection, some flicker of the love I thought we shared, and he jerked away with a sharpness that felt like betrayal incarnate, his voice slicing through me as if it were a knife honed for the task, saying words I would never forget, words that would echo in my mind for years. "You're dead to us too." The sound of those words felt like a physical blow, knocking the breath out of me and leaving me gasping in a storm of disbelief and sorrow, and as I looked around at the assembled mourners, I realized that no one truly understood the storm raging inside me, the mixture of anger, grief, and utter devastation that threatened to consume me entirely. Friends and relatives murmured their condolences, offering polite gestures and careful smiles, but their words floated over me, hollow and meaningless, unable to reach the raw wound that had opened inside my soul. Memories of my wife and I, long nights talking about dreams, sharing secrets, laughing at silly jokes only we understood, played before my eyes like a cruel montage, reminding me of the life we had shared and the love that had been shattered in an instant by the betrayal of the one I trusted most. The funeral, instead of offering closure, became a battlefield of emotions, where grief fought with rage, and sorrow tangled with disbelief in a way that left me dizzy and disoriented. I could feel the eyes of strangers on me, weighing, judging, pitying, and yet none of them could sense the betrayal that had pierced my heart, a betrayal so deep that it redefined the meaning of family, loyalty, and trust. As the coffin was lowered into the earth, each thud of the wood against the ground sounded like a drumbeat marking the end of a life I had cherished and the beginning of a war I was now determined to fight, a war that would not be fought with fists or weapons but with cunning, patience, and a resolve forged in the fire of my grief. The sound of the dirt hitting the coffin seemed deafening, and I felt as if it buried not only her body but also the remnants of the family I thought I had, leaving me in a void where anger and sadness mingled into a poison I could not spit out. My son's eyes avoided mine, his gaze wandering, indifferent, and the distance he created cut deeper than any knife, a deliberate chasm that separated us and forced me to confront the painful truth that the boy I had raised had become a stranger, someone I no longer recognized, someone who had chosen betrayal over love. As the mourners filed out of the cemetery, offering murmured condolences to my son and patting his back, I felt an alien sense of isolation, as though the world had betrayed me as much as he had, leaving me alone with my grief and my rage, standing over a grave that symbolized more than death. It symbolized the collapse of trust, the fracture of family, and the awakening of a darkness I had not known I possessed. That night, I returned to the house we had shared, a place now filled with echoes of laughter, arguments, and quiet nights that seemed impossibly distant, and I sat alone in the living room, clutching my wife's scarf to my chest, inhaling her scent one last time, and feeling a quiet, searing fury rise within me, a determination that no one could ever take away. I replayed the moment my son had spoken those words, imagining the smirk I thought I saw, the satisfaction he believed he had earned, and I felt a fierce need for justice, a desire to make him understand that every betrayal has consequences, no matter how hidden or carefully concealed. As the hours passed, I found myself piecing together memories of my life with my wife, the sacrifices we had made, the love we had shared, and the hope we had built for our family, and I realized that grief alone was not enough to honor her. Action was required, a deliberate, calculated reclaiming of the life we had lost and the dignity that had been stolen from me. I thought of the friends and acquaintances who had sided with my son in small, subtle ways, the whispers behind doors, the casual comments that had undermined our family, and I began to see a pattern, a web of deceit that extended far beyond the single moment at the funeral. Every memory, every detail, became a piece of a larger puzzle, and I understood that revenge would not be a simple act but a series of calculated moves, each designed to expose the truth and teach lessons long overdue. I stayed awake all night, staring at photographs of my wife, whispering to her as though she could hear me, recounting the betrayal in my own words, and swearing an oath that I would not rest until those who had caused her pain, and now mine, felt the weight of their choices. Sleep came fitfully, filled with nightmares of broken trust, empty houses, and cold eyes, but even in those dreams, a plan began to take shape, a path toward justice and reckoning that was as inevitable as the sunrise. By morning, the hollow emptiness had transformed into a steely resolve, a conviction that grief must fuel action and that betrayal, no matter how deep or carefully hidden, could be met with consequences that were both precise and unyielding. As I walked through the silent halls of our home, every step echoed with memories and with the growing determination that my son would learn, in his own way, that declaring someone dead in your life comes with a price that cannot be avoided. I thought of the conversations we had once shared, of the lessons I had tried to instill, and of the love that had once bound us, and I realized that those bonds, though severed by treachery, had not disappeared entirely. They had transformed into a force that could now be wielded to reclaim dignity, to honor my wife, and to confront betrayal with the sharpest weapon I possessed, calculated truth and undeniable evidence. I began to write notes, to track movements, to observe patterns, and in each small observation, I felt the first sparks of empowerment, a realization that though grief had brought me low, it also revealed the path forward, the path of quiet, unstoppable retribution. That day, the house felt alive with possibility, a quiet battlefield waiting for its first confrontation, and I sat by the window, staring at the world beyond, imagining the moment when the storm I had been nurturing would finally break, and when my son would understand, in the deepest part of his being, that words spoken in betrayal could never erase the truth, nor could they erase the consequences that awaited. I promised myself I would remain patient, that every action would be deliberate, that every revelation would be timed to maximize the impact, and in that patience, I discovered a strange peace, a sense of purpose that grief alone had never given me. The funeral had not broken me, it had awakened me. And as the sun set, casting long shadows across the empty rooms, I felt the first taste of the power that grief and betrayal had combined to forge, a power that would soon change everything, and a resolve that nothing, not even my own son, could diminish. In the days after the funeral, the silence of the house pressed down on me with a weight that was almost suffocating, as if the walls themselves were aware of the betrayal that had been inflicted upon me and the emptiness that now consumed every corner of our once warm home. I began to sift through the remnants of our life together, searching for answers, seeking clues, desperate to understand how the boy I had raised, the son I had nurtured with endless patience and love, could have turned so cold, so calculating, and so cruel. Each drawer I opened, each old file I examined, revealed a fragment of the truth, a secret carefully hidden from both my wife and me, and with every new discovery, the pain deepened, twisting itself into a gnawing rage that I could neither contain nor escape. Bank statements showed withdrawals I did not authorize, emails hinted at manipulations and lies woven so intricately that I felt almost complicit in my own ignorance, and letters tucked away in forgotten corners revealed schemes that my son had carefully orchestrated to gain control over things that were never meant to be his alone. I discovered contracts signed in his name, debts accrued under false pretenses, and alliances formed behind our backs with people we had once trusted implicitly, and the realization struck me with the force of a hammer. This was not merely a momentary lapse of morality or a petty act of rebellion. This was deliberate, calculated betrayal, executed with precision and without remorse. Memories of the nights my wife had spoken about her suspicions, only to dismiss them with a smile and a gentle word, haunted me, and I felt a hollow fury for both her vulnerability and my own failure to see the truth before it was too late. As I pieced together the timeline of his actions, I could almost see the sequence of events unfold, the careful planting of false narratives, the subtle gaslighting of those around him, and the ruthless ambition that had driven him to isolate us emotionally and financially, leaving me bereft, confused, and powerless in the days following her death. I realized that the betrayal extended beyond personal grievances. It had infiltrated our entire family network, touching friends, business associates, and even neighbors, Each interaction now tinted with the realization that loyalty had been exploited, trust had been weaponized, and love had been taken as a weakness to manipulate. Night after night, I sat alone at the dining table, poring over documents, making notes, connecting dots that my wife had never lived to uncover, and with each revelation, a plan began to form in my mind. Intricate and deliberate, designed not merely to punish but to expose, to educate, and to reclaim the dignity that had been stripped from our family. I thought back to the funeral, to the moment he had spoken those cold, unforgiving words, and I felt the memory sharpen like a knife, each syllable a reminder of the urgency of what had to be done, each glance a call to action that I could not ignore. The house became a fortress of secrets, the living room cluttered with papers, photographs, emails printed and pinned on the walls, and every detail meticulously tracked, revealing patterns of deceit that were almost artistic in their complexity, a testament to my son's cunning and my determination to counter it. I discovered that he had manipulated mutual friends into doubting my intentions, convincing them that I was grieving too selfishly, too intensely, too recklessly, and that my pursuit of justice was somehow wrong. And I realized that his power lay not only in his direct actions but in the way he had turned the world around him against us, isolating us until we were vulnerable and exposed. Each revelation brought waves of anger so intense that I often found myself gripping the edges of tables, pacing the halls, and whispering my frustrations into the emptiness, but beneath the fury was a quiet, burning sorrow, a grief for the woman I had loved, the life we had built, and the family we had once been. I remembered her laughter, the way she had smiled at our son, and the way she had believed in his goodness even when my instincts had told me otherwise, and that memory cut through the rage with a sharper pain, reminding me that my revenge was not for pride, but for the memory of her trust, her love, and the innocence that had been destroyed. I learned of secret meetings he had held with distant relatives, their casual conversations hiding strategic discussions about money, inheritance, and alliances, and I realized that every friendly gesture he had made had been a calculated maneuver, each smile a mask concealing the cold ambition that now threatened to swallow everything we had built. I uncovered instances where he had misrepresented facts to create doubt in my wife's mind, causing her to question her own judgment, and I felt the cruel irony of her death being the moment when his manipulation had reached its peak, leaving me to inherit not only grief but the full magnitude of his treachery. As the days passed, my sorrow transformed into a simmering determination, a focus that sharpened with each document analyzed, each secret uncovered, and each lie brought to light, until I began to see a path forward, a plan of retribution that was as methodical as the betrayal itself. I began to understand the psychology behind his actions, the arrogance that made him believe he could manipulate everyone and remain untouchable, and in that understanding, I found the first seeds of control. The knowledge that foresight and patience could turn his confidence into his greatest vulnerability. I created lists, charts, and timelines, plotting every move, every connection, and every opportunity to expose him, knowing that the truth, once revealed, would be more devastating than any confrontation I could stage without preparation. I thought of the friends who had unknowingly enabled his schemes, the business partners who had been misled, and the neighbors who had been subtly influenced, and I realized that when the plan unfolded, the shock would not only be personal but public, a reckoning that would leave no room for denial. The anger that had threatened to consume me became a tool, harnessed carefully, tempered by the memory of my wife's gentle voice and her unwavering belief in justice, reminding me that the path I walked was not blind vengeance, but deliberate correction of the wrongs done to those I loved. I rehearsed conversations in my mind, imagining how I would confront him, how I would reveal the layers of deceit, and how I would make him understand that betrayal is never without consequence. And each imagined scenario strengthened my resolve, making me feel less like a victim and more like a force of reckoning. Late at night, I would revisit her letters, the notes she had left behind, the small reminders of her intuition, and I felt her presence guiding me, urging me to act with precision, to be patient, and to ensure that justice was not merely symbolic, but absolute and undeniable. Every piece of evidence I found, from bank statements to old emails, from whispered rumors to confessions caught in passing, was cataloged, cross-referenced, and analyzed, each contributing to a growing map of his deception that I could navigate with certainty, turning the chaos he had created into a system of knowledge and power. I thought about his face at the funeral, the smugness he had worn like armor, and I felt a cold, deliberate planning begin to settle in my mind. A promise that one day he would face the consequences of his actions in a way that was carefully orchestrated and unavoidable. My grief fueled the planning, my sorrow gave depth to my strategy, and my anger ensured that every detail was considered, leaving nothing to chance, and in this careful construction of vengeance, I discovered an unexpected clarity, a sense of purpose that grief alone could never have given. Days turned into nights, and nights into early mornings, and through it all, I worked in silence, often speaking only to myself, reminding myself of the stakes, the betrayal, and the memory of my wife, who had trusted both of us and now depended on me, in memory, to restore what had been lost. Each small revelation about my son's schemes, each hidden alliance uncovered, became a brick in the foundation of the plan I was building, a structure of justice that would, when complete, leave no doubt about the truth of his actions and the inevitability of his downfall. I imagined the moment of confrontation, how the shock would etch itself on his face, how the arrogance that had once defined him would crumble, and in those imaginings, I found the patience to continue, the motivation to keep uncovering the truths that had been hidden so carefully from all of us. I began to see him not only as my son but as a symbol of betrayal, a reminder that love and trust are not always safeguarded by blood alone, and that in this world, even those closest to us can harbor darkness that must be met with both courage and cunning. Each day, I cataloged his moves, predicted his next steps, and prepared countermeasures, knowing that the smallest mistake could unravel the entire plan, and yet, with each careful observation, my confidence grew, and the anger that had once threatened to consume me became a focused energy that propelled me forward. I considered his motivations, the greed, the pride, and the need for control, and I realized that understanding his psychology was as crucial as uncovering the facts. For only by knowing how he thought could I craft a strategy that would be truly effective, a strategy that would not merely punish him but expose him completely. By the end of the week, the house had transformed from a place of mourning into a headquarters of strategy, a silent command center where every document, photograph, and observation was a weapon in the arsenal of justice I was building. The grief remained, sharp and unyielding, but it had become a fuel, a fire that could drive meticulous action and deliberate decision-making. And I understood that the only way to honor my wife's memory was not through despair but through decisive, calculated action that ensured the truth could not be hidden and betrayal could not go unpunished. After days and nights spent uncovering every secret, every betrayal, and every carefully concealed lie, I realized that knowledge alone was not enough. To bring justice, action was required, precise and calculated, and so I began to set the trap, a plan that would unfold slowly, carefully, and inevitably, until my son would see the consequences of his arrogance and deceit in the clearest possible way. I observed him from a distance, noting every habit, every routine, every person he trusted implicitly, and I cataloged these observations in meticulous detail, understanding that even the smallest oversight could ruin the plan I had worked so tirelessly to construct. Each morning, I would watch him leave the house, confident and smug, as though the world belonged to him and that his betrayal had gone unnoticed, and I felt a growing thrill at the thought that soon, very soon, his confidence would be his undoing. I planted subtle hints, manipulated conversations, and created situations that appeared ordinary but were actually carefully designed to elicit responses, revealing patterns and weaknesses that would later serve as keys to the trap I was assembling. I contacted old acquaintances who had been unknowingly influenced by him, framing my inquiries innocently while gathering vital information, and I realized that the very people he believed to be his allies were now unwitting pieces in the puzzle I was constructing. Small confrontations, seemingly coincidental, were orchestrated to test his reactions, to map his instincts, and to identify the precise points at which his arrogance could be leveraged against him, and each response I recorded added depth to the strategy that had begun to feel unstoppable in its clarity. I created a series of letters and documents, carefully drafted to look accidental or incidental, yet containing enough detail to provoke reactions, sow doubt, and subtly manipulate the perceptions of those around him, ensuring that when the time came, the revelations would be undeniable and the impact catastrophic. Every interaction he had was watched and cataloged, and I began to see the network of influence he had created unraveling quietly under the weight of his own overconfidence, as if the very web he had spun for control was now becoming a snare around his neck. I learned to anticipate his moves, understanding that the more brazen he felt, the more vulnerable he actually was, and I began to construct scenarios where his bravado would become his weakness, each one building toward a moment of exposure so complete that there could be no denial, no excuse, and no escape. I rehearsed conversations, imagined confrontations, and simulated outcomes, leaving nothing to chance, and in the quiet hours of the night, I felt a sense of power growing inside me, a calm assurance that the trap, when sprung, would leave him unprepared for the magnitude of what he had set in motion. I discovered that he had made assumptions about my grief and weakness, believing that I was too consumed by sorrow to act, and I used that assumption as a weapon, knowing that his overconfidence would blind him to the careful calculations I had made at every step. I began to arrange meetings and encounters under the guise of reconciliation, negotiations, or mundane discussions, all of which were meticulously designed to test his responses, measure his patience, and identify cracks in the armor of arrogance he displayed so effortlessly. Each day, I adjusted the plan, refining timing, perfecting phrasing, and ensuring that the eventual confrontation would be executed flawlessly, and with each adjustment, my understanding of him deepened, revealing the vulnerabilities he had long hidden from the world and even from himself. I thought about the moments at the funeral, the words that had cut me deeply, and I channeled that pain into precision, transforming grief and anger into tools of strategy rather than chaos, allowing the fire inside me to forge clarity instead of confusion. I enlisted allies discreetly, people who had been quietly wronged by him, framing their participation in ways that seemed coincidental or serendipitous, and I watched as their presence and subtle influence slowly tightened the noose around his overconfidence, ensuring that every element of the plan converged toward a single, inevitable moment of reckoning. I created false trails and misdirections, making him believe he remained in control, while every apparent victory he experienced only brought him closer to the consequences I had prepared. And in this careful orchestration, I found a strange satisfaction, a sense of justice forming before the final act even began. I imagined the look on his face when the first pieces of evidence were revealed, when the web of deceit he had spun for years collapsed under the weight of truth, and each imagined expression strengthened my patience, teaching me that timing was as crucial as execution. I practiced subtle manipulations in tone, body language, and phrasing, crafting conversations that would make him reveal himself without realizing it, and I recognized that the smallest gestures, the briefest slips, would be the keys to unraveling the arrogance that had blinded him to the loyalty and love he had destroyed. Each document I prepared, each conversation I staged, each observation I recorded was a step in a dance of precision and control, and I took care to ensure that no one but him would be caught in the full force of the plan, keeping collateral damage to a minimum while maximizing the impact of exposure and justice. I considered every possible contingency, every potential obstacle, and every unexpected interference, and I built countermeasures into the plan, understanding that flexibility combined with foresight would ensure success, even if circumstances shifted unpredictably. I reflected on my wife's memory constantly, letting her wisdom guide my decisions, imagining what she would have done, what she would have approved, and her presence became a steady compass, ensuring that my pursuit of revenge remained precise and deliberate rather than reckless and emotionally driven. I visualized the final confrontation endlessly, rehearsing words, gestures, and sequences of revelation until the scenario felt tangible, almost inevitable, as though every step had already occurred in a preordained sequence and I was merely the instrument to make it real. The subtle adjustments, the small provocations, and the carefully planted observations built tension slowly, ensuring that when the moment arrived, it would have maximum psychological impact, leaving him disoriented, vulnerable, and exposed in ways he could not have anticipated. I considered his friends and allies, noting which of them could be swayed to see the truth and which would resist, and I carefully orchestrated their exposure, timing, and involvement so that his network of influence would collapse from within, reinforcing the inevitability of the trap's success. I used patience as a weapon, letting days and even weeks pass while monitoring every reaction, every slip, every detail, and allowing the sense of security my son felt to grow, knowing that his false confidence would make the eventual revelation all the more devastating. I crafted letters, emails, and subtle communications that appeared innocuous, yet contained carefully hidden messages, timing, and triggers that would later align perfectly with the events I had staged, ensuring that every revelation would appear simultaneous, overwhelming, and undeniable. I imagined the moment he realized that nothing was as it seemed, that every action he had taken had been anticipated, and that the safety he believed he had was an illusion, and I felt a quiet satisfaction, knowing that his arrogance had created the very conditions for his own downfall. Each interaction, each seemingly ordinary event, each social encounter became a thread woven into the trap, and I ensured that these threads converged in a way that left no escape, no denial, and no doubt about the consequences of betrayal. I rehearsed patience daily, understanding that impulsiveness could ruin the plan, and I reminded myself that the slow unfolding of justice would be far more effective than immediate retaliation, allowing the impact of each revelation to resonate fully, leaving no room for excuses or rationalizations. I observed his patterns carefully, noting which behaviors were predictable, which were manipulative, and which were vulnerable to exposure, and I crafted strategies that turned every one of these characteristics against him, ensuring that the trap would exploit both his skills and his weaknesses. I reflected constantly on the motivations behind his actions, imagining the pride, greed, and hubris that had driven him, and I realized that the very traits he had cultivated to dominate others were the same traits that would ensure his undoing when exposed to the light of truth. Every conversation I staged, every encounter I orchestrated, and every observation I recorded was executed with precision, ensuring that my plan was airtight, my patience unshakable, and my eventual confrontation inevitable, and I felt a growing confidence in the ability of strategy, knowledge, and timing to deliver justice where emotion alone could not. I reviewed the evidence repeatedly, cross-checking facts, confirming sequences, and ensuring that no detail had been overlooked, knowing that even a single error could allow him to slip through. And I marveled at the intricate web that had been constructed, both by his betrayal and by my careful preparation. I envisioned the exact moment he would realize that everything he had counted on had been manipulated, anticipated, and exposed, and in that visualization, I felt a sense of poetic justice, a symmetry between his actions and the consequences he would now face. I prepared for resistance, for denial, and for the instinctive arrogance he would bring to the confrontation, and I built contingencies into every stage, understanding that a careful, methodical approach would leave him no room to maneuver or deflect responsibility. I allowed the tension to build naturally, creating an environment where every action, every reaction, and every observation contributed to the inevitability of his exposure, and I felt a growing sense of empowerment, knowing that patience, strategy, and precision were my allies in this endeavor. The trap was no longer just a plan, it had become a living construct, a framework of inevitability, and I walked through each step mentally, ensuring that the timing, the execution, and the impact would converge to deliver the consequences he had brought upon himself. The day of reckoning finally arrived, and the house that had been silent for weeks seemed to hum with anticipation, as though it knew the moment of confrontation had come, and I could feel every heartbeat in my chest matching the rhythm of the tension that had been building meticulously for months. I waited quietly in the study, surrounded by carefully organized evidence, documents, photographs, and notes, each piece representing a step in the trap I had set, and I reviewed every detail one last time, ensuring that nothing had been overlooked, nothing left to chance, and that the moment would unfold exactly as I had planned. My son arrived at the appointed time, his steps hesitant yet confident, a strange mix of arrogance and unease in his posture, and I observed him carefully, noting the flickers of doubt that betrayed his otherwise polished facade. He smiled, a smile that I once would have found comforting, but now it seemed hollow, a mask that could not hide the tension coiling within him, and I felt a surge of anticipation, knowing that the carefully constructed web of his deceit was about to unravel before his very eyes. I greeted him politely, maintaining a calm exterior that concealed the storm of emotions raging beneath the surface, and I invited him to sit, offering him a gesture of hospitality that was both genuine in appearance and strategic in purpose, designed to lower his defenses and make him believe he remained in control. As he settled into the chair, I handed him a folder, heavy with documents, photographs, and evidence, and I watched his eyes narrow in confusion and curiosity as he began to understand that this was no ordinary meeting, no routine discussion, but a reckoning he had never anticipated. I let him read slowly, allowing each revelation to sink in, and I observed the subtle changes in his expression, the tightening of his jaw, the quickening of his breathing, the flash of panic in his eyes, as the carefully documented betrayals, manipulations, and lies he had crafted over years were exposed in undeniable detail. Each photograph, each bank statement, each email, and each witness account was strategically placed to hit with maximum impact. And I felt a quiet satisfaction as his arrogance began to crumble under the weight of truth, a collapse that had been months in the making and was now inevitable. I spoke calmly, deliberately, explaining how every action he had taken had been observed, documented, and anticipated, and I watched as his attempts to justify, deny, or deflect were rendered meaningless by the clarity and thoroughness of the evidence. The room seemed to shrink around him as realization dawned, the walls closing in with the weight of his own deception, and I could see the confusion and fear beginning to replace the arrogance he had carried so effortlessly for so long. I reminded him of the moments at the funeral, of the words he had spoken with such cold certainty, and I noted the flicker of regret that passed across his features, a recognition that the consequences of his betrayal had finally arrived and that there would be no escape. I handed him another envelope, smaller this time, containing letters, recordings, and statements from those he had deceived, and I watched as his hands trembled slightly. The first physical manifestation of the psychological pressure he had never anticipated. I continued to speak, detailing the timeline of his actions, the networks of manipulation he had constructed, and the way each move had been countered, anticipated, and documented, and with each sentence, I could see the layers of his confidence peeling away, leaving him exposed, vulnerable, and utterly unprepared for the reality of his situation. I maintained a calm, measured tone, allowing the full weight of his guilt, fear, and helplessness to settle in, knowing that the impact would be far greater if delivered steadily, like water eroding stone, rather than in a sudden, explosive confrontation. I reminded him that every ally he thought he could rely on had been subtly influenced, that every relationship he had manipulated was now aware of the truth, and that his social and financial networks were collapsing quietly but inexorably around him. The panic in his eyes grew as he realized the magnitude of what had been orchestrated, and I could almost hear the silent screams of desperation echoing within him, even as he tried to maintain a veneer of control that was rapidly disintegrating. I explained to him that this was not merely revenge, but a reclamation of dignity, justice for the woman we had loved, and a lesson in the inevitability of consequences for betrayal, and I could see the slow dawning of understanding, mixed with fear and disbelief, spreading across his face. I reminded him of the trust he had violated, the love he had squandered, and the family he had torn apart, and each word I spoke seemed to weigh heavier than the last, pressing him further into the realization that the life he had built on deception was now fragile and exposed. I watched as he attempted to speak, to deny, to justify, but his words faltered, tripping over the undeniable facts laid bare before him, and I could see the physical manifestations of stress, the shallow breaths, the trembling fingers, the twitching of his face, as he processed the impossibility of escaping accountability. I handed him a final envelope, marked simply "Your last wish," and I told him that inside were the consequences he had sought to avoid, a roadmap showing every betrayal, every lie, and every manipulation he had carried out, now revealed to everyone who mattered, and as he opened it, his hands shaking visibly, I could see the realization in his eyes that the life he had believed secure was now unraveling before him. The documents inside contained not only evidence but statements from those he had wronged, photographs, recordings, and written accounts that would make any attempt at denial futile, and I watched as the magnitude of the trap I had built became undeniable, crushing the arrogance and pride that had sustained him for so long. I allowed silence to fill the room, letting the weight of the revelation sink in fully, and I watched as he began to comprehend that every move he had made, every betrayal he had committed, had been anticipated, documented, and meticulously countered, and that there was no way to escape the consequences now set in motion. I observed the gradual transformation of his expressions, from confusion to panic, from panic to despair, and finally to a quiet, stunned recognition of his helplessness, a moment of absolute clarity where he understood that the trap was complete and that his life, as he knew it, had been irreversibly altered. I spoke softly, calmly, emphasizing the inevitability of accountability, the importance of justice, and the lessons he had ignored in life, and I watched as his body slumped slightly, the tension leaving him in waves, replaced by a dawning comprehension of the reality he had created for himself. I reminded him of the memories we had shared, the love he had been given, and the choices he had made to betray that love, and I watched as the guilt and sorrow began to intertwine with fear, creating a psychological weight that was inescapable, undeniable, and transformative. I guided him through each revelation, step by step, allowing him to witness the full scope of his actions and the consequences that were now unavoidable, and I could see the internal collapse, the surrender to truth, that had been months, even years, in preparation. I emphasized that this confrontation was not born of malice alone, but of necessity, justice, and the preservation of dignity, and I could see the subtle shift in him, the first real understanding of the cost of betrayal and the irrevocable impact of his choices. I let the quiet moments linger, allowing him to process fully, to feel fully, and to recognize the depth of what he had wrought, knowing that this slow, deliberate pacing would ingrain the lesson more deeply than any immediate or violent reaction could. I observed his body language, his expressions, and his breathing, noting the signs of stress, realization, and vulnerability, and I allowed each moment to reinforce the inevitability of accountability, the unbreakable chain of cause and effect that had been meticulously planned over months. I reminded him that this was the culmination of every lie, every manipulation, every betrayal, and that each person he had wronged would now understand the truth, and I could see the full horror of that realization dawn in his eyes, a recognition that the facade of control he had maintained was now shattered beyond repair. I allowed him to read, to process, and to internalize the consequences fully, watching every subtle change in demeanor, every flicker of panic, every moment of hesitation, knowing that each was a sign that the trap was complete and that justice had been executed with precision. I reminded him that his choices had led to this moment, that betrayal always carries a price, and that the life he had tried to build on manipulation was now exposed to scrutiny, judgment, and the inevitability of consequences that could no longer be avoided. I let the room remain quiet, the documents open, the evidence laid bare, and I observed as the psychological weight of realization and accountability pressed upon him, transforming arrogance into fear, confidence into despair, and control into helplessness. I emphasized, gently but firmly, that this confrontation was not revenge for revenge's sake, but the fulfillment of a promise, the assertion of justice, and the preservation of dignity for those who had been wronged, and I could see the understanding settle slowly in his eyes, as clarity replaced denial, and acceptance replaced defiance.